synopsis of this chapter. What this chapter talks about is, the whole argument here is pretty much convincing. In other words, the international events, crises, or wars, or state behaviors in general, there are two ways of explaining those state behaviors or international events, wars, crises. Two ways of explaining it. One is, as we looked at the realist chapter, we find the sources of these state behaviors in the international system. The international system. In other words, wars break up because of such and such, types of international system, right? Distribution of power, right? Multipolar, bipolar, right? Such and such, or the anarchy, right? Absence of sovereignty, absence of central authority. Sorry. That's one way of explaining sources of state behavior. The second way, which is the topic of today, the other view on state behaviors, or the other ways of explaining wars, events, crises, is, well, that's a good way of explaining it. I mean, we need to look at the international system, right? System characteristics. But at the end of the day, without explaining what happens inside the state, how could we explain, right, those wars? Which is more important? Nobody knows. I think both of them are important. Systemic characters, internal state characters, both of them are important. So today's focus, although we covered liberal socialist theories last week, the focus today is particularly how individual policymakers make decisions, which is called foreign policy. Foreign policy is decision making. I mean, the first line of this chapter. The foreign policy process is a process of decision making. So this chapter, titled Foreign Policy Process, right? Foreign policy process is a process of decision making. How decision making occurs internally, which is within the scope of liberal social rather than a realist tradition. Now, in the first hour, we'll cover two things today. Number one, first we'll cover individual decision-making process. We'll look at that. Individual decision-making process. How individual policymakers reach such and such policy outcomes, foreign policy outcomes. Okay? Which incorporates more than political science. To understand how decisions are made, you need to look into various, neighboring disciplines like psychology or even journalism, right? Cognitive science. So it's much more than political science itself, international politics itself. To study decision-making process is much more than political science. But that's what we do. So how individual decision-making occurs, that's the first subject today. About this, there are two things. Rational decision-making process. Rational decision-making process, according to which every decision maker is a rational decision maker, rational actor. Okay? They take cost benefit, factors into consideration in making any decision. Rationality here is most important thing. Rationality. Individual decision makers are rational. So what drives them to make a decision is rationality. They are rational. Cost-benefit analysis. Whoever makes decision doesn't matter. Doesn't make any much difference. Second, non-rational decision-making process. People are not rational according to the second type of analysis, second line of analysis. People are not rational. There are many things that get in the way of rationality, rational decision-making process. So decision-making is a combination of rational, irrational, or non-rational, or bounded rational decision-making. Combination of it. 윤재상. Realists and liberals, they take different views on this regarding rationality, non-rationality, or bounded rationality. How do realists think about this decision-making process in terms of rationality, non-rationality, or bounded rationality? Which line of thinking is this rational decision-making process kind of view? Is it liberal view or realist view? According to realists, how decisions occur. According to liberals, how decisions occur. First, let's get some answer from him first, 윤재상. According to your reading, do realists and liberals have different views on this in terms of rationality, irrationality, decision-making process?
I believe realists, they are more to they make decisions out of self-interest, like what the state really needs, and that kind of leads to how they make their decisions.
Okay, realists, they take self-interest seriously. You're right. But in terms of decision making, they pursue self-interest, which is right. But in terms of making a decision, how do they make decisions according to realists? How do foreign policymakers make decisions according to realist assumptions? All right. Okay. 오원창.
I think the best example of the rationality of decision making of rationalists, I think during the World War II, when the America dropped the bomb into Japan, into two cities, and this was like from the rational perspective, because they first think about the national security. It doesn't matter how they can defend, even it takes like a lot of millions of people. If they even die, they have to save the national security. But in case of another studies, libertarian.
Liberal theory.
Liberals, they mostly concern about the people's lives.
People's lives?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Why is that so? So realists are much more cruel. They don't care about people's lives.
I don't think that is cruel, but they just thinking that national security of the whole country is like the main purpose of the country, to save the country.
Oh, okay. All right. I can understand that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that is why they use defensive tools and coercive attacking tools also. So I think so.
All right. His point is that realists, when they talk about self-interest or national self-interest, they take care of more broader interests, national interests. Whereas liberals, they take care of more non-state level, individual, citizen level type of, life, people's lives. Okay. Which is a good point. Not 100% right, but good starting point. Good starting point. So liberals, they take from the bottom up. Really,
they mainly defend minorities in the country, like teachers, like doctors, and
all right.
students. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Good point. Good point. Good enough. Good enough. Because I haven't begun yet. I'm just giving you a summary of the whole chapter. So rationality model and non-rationality model. Okay. There are two models of decision making, okay, in discussing foreign policy decision making. So we'll get into that. What is the rationality model, irrationality model? Rationality model, you're right, rationality model is not 100%, but mostly argued by realists. Rationality model by realists, okay? Non-rationality model or bounded rationality model, liberal assumptions. Okay, liberal assumptions. Won-Chang, you're right. You're in the right direction. You're in the right direction. They argue that realist national interest, they look at broader issue, is along the same line of this argument. Rationality argument. Although you have to make a link between broader realist national interest type of argument and rationality argument. You have to make a link between that, between these two. Or your argument about social, more individual, people's type of liberal argument, and you have to make a link between that and irrationality model. You have to make a link there. Now, so there are two models, rationality model, irrationality model, okay? The second issue here today, which will come up in the second hour, in the second segment of this class, is, so the first, to look at how decisions are made, we first look at individuals, right? How individuals make decisions. Second, we need to look at the broader, like a organizational structure in which individuals make decisions. That's the second issue that we need to discuss in the second segment. Organizational structure. Here, the main argument here is where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit. That's the point. In other words, what kind of decision you make depends on which organization you belong to. Okay, a little bit different argument. A little bit different argument. So bureaucratic model or organizational model, that's what it is called. Okay? Now, rationality model first. In other words, individual decision-making process. That's the first topic we need to discuss. Individual decision-making process. Rational decision-making process, when you talk about rational decision-making process, rationality model, in other words, rationality model, I think, depends on two important things. First, the decision maker, okay, should have a full control over information. That's the first assumption about rationality model. Decision maker has all the information he or she should have. Okay? There is enough information always provided, okay, in the decision-making process. There is no lack of information. Information is always fully provided. That's the assumption under the rationality model. Second important assumption, the decision-maker, the decision-making process is not affected by other small outside factors. This is the second assumption. In other words, people's personal beliefs, values, people's personal values, individual values, or his personal background, ethnic or whatever, personal background, or any type of external outside factors do not affect the decision-making process. Only rational thinking affects decision-making process. Do you think this is always how decision-making process occurs? No? Why? Give us an example. Why this is an oversimplification of reality? Give us a good example of, like for instance, North Korean example. How Kim Jong-un or the North Korean government reaches a decision. Could we explain North Korean foreign policy from a rationality model? When Kim Jong-un goes ahead and develops a bomb, then does he proceed from this rationality model? He has a full information over when he decides on developing a weapon, then he has a full information as to how South Korea responds, how the US responds, how Japan responds, how China responds. So Kim Jong-un has a full information. Okay? And he's a rational decision maker. I mean, he takes care of his own country's national interests, no doubt about that. He's a rational, unitary decision maker. He proceeds from full information, okay? No holds barred, full information. He makes a decision. Okay? Then he develops a bomb, then he announces it. How much close is this to reality? Or South Korean foreign policy decision-making process? To what extent decision makers proceed from this rational decision-making process? You might raise questions, does he really have full control over information? Right? How about his personal background, personal background, or his hatred toward South Korea? Does it have any impact on the decision-making process? So that, you know, his extreme hatred toward South Korea, which is an external factor, if it really affects the decision-making process, then the information processing, in other words, according to information, objective information, he should not develop weapons, right? If he's a rational decision maker. But there are many outside factors that affect the decision-making process, which is irrational outside factors, right? So rational decision-making model is always an oversimplification. But why should we take this case, rationality model, into consideration? Even as we know this is an oversimplification, right? Why realists proceed from this unrealistic, oversimplified decision-making model? That's the question you need to ask. Why to realists? Why to realists this kind of oversimplified decision-making process appeal to realists? Now, then we get to non-rational model, non-rationality model. If decision-making is not always rational, there are many more irrational factors involved or unexpected outside external factors. What are these, right? What are these irrational or non-rational or bounded rational factors that get in the way of rational decision-making process? There are many theories and books about this. First type of irrational decision-making theory is, let's look at some of the it's always difficult to match what I state and what appears PowerPoints. Now, one of the irrational model is the kind of theories that considers values and beliefs. Individual values and beliefs affect kind of decision making you arrive at, you reach, right? Individual values and beliefs affect decision-making process, which is quite natural argument, yes, right? I think if you disregard this, you lack a huge factor here. Individual values and beliefs, I think huge impact, particularly those big decision makers like presidents or ministers. Again, North Korean example, like Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un. Why do they keep on, right? Why do they keep on making troubles in international politics? We need to understand their values and beliefs. Maybe they still hold some Marxist, right? Or uniquely Asian, uniquely Korean type of Marxist values and beliefs, which we never understand, right? His personal values and beliefs. Or President Bush, when he was in presidency, kind of foreign policy he made. We need to understand his values. Maybe his religious values. Okay, when he takes on these terrorists or Russians, okay, behind it, maybe his religious beliefs, Christian religious beliefs or values. It might lie behind this, anti-terrorism, foreign policy. Second, some psychology. We need to look into psychoanalytic type of process here involved. This textbook takes an example of President Clinton. 윤철호. President Clinton is looked at from psychoanalytic, his foreign policy sometimes used to be looked at from psychoanalytic type of approaches. What is it like? How could we President Clinton's foreign policy from psychoanalytic approaches? Give us an example.
It says that because of his childhood,
Mm-hmm.
violent father, he was always like trying to reduce disruption. So basically, he was like more of a peacemaker kind of person instead of like making more stuff.
Okay, so he's like his alcoholic stepfather, his childhood subconscious type of childhood experience still affected, right? When he was in presidency, so he was much more of a peacemaker than of a aggressor. Now, thirdly, another type of external factor, irrational external factor, is something called misperception. What misperception means is, here, the assumption here is the information, information decision makers get cannot be fully provided. That's the first assumption here. Cannot be fully provided. But what misperception argues is information may be lacking, probably because of the filtering process, information filtering process, information screening process is insufficient, so that decision makers perceives mistakenly such and such situation, so that he makes sometimes bad decision or good decisions, right? Similar argument, but here information screening process cannot be fully sufficient, so that decision makers have misperceptions on a certain issue. Number 4, type of irrationality model, irrationality theory, is in making a decision, information is important, but information alone doesn't reach a decision. What affects decision-making process? In addition to information, sometimes emotions important. Emotions important. This is in fact referred to as affective bias. Affective bias. Affective bias, it could be either positive or negative, right? Like I mentioned, President Kim Jong-un, not president, leader Kim Jong-un, when he makes a decision, okay, on a certain issue, his emotions vis-a-vis South Korea might affect, right? His disliking about South Korea. Or sometimes certain decision makers liking about a certain country. right? Affect decision-making process. Number 5, sometimes cognitively, decision makers cognitively make decisions, which is called cognitive bias. A little bit complicated here. Cognitive bias. How decision makers cognitively make a decision. What does it mean? 이준구, what are you talking about here? Cognitive decision-making process. Why should we look at a cognitive aspect in looking at decision-making process? How does it work?
Cognitive biases are kind of so decision making isn't based on emotional feelings, but it's actually simply on like limitations of human brain in making various choices.
Okay. Limitations in human brain. What kind of limitation?
So maybe since it's not based on emotional feelings,
Mm-hmm.
like maybe problems for a human in the brain. So maybe like if they have mental problems that can cause biases.
Are you sure?
This is just my opinion.
Okay. Are you sure about that? 임건, how does this work in terms of, there are kind of cognitive theories here, right? Like a wishful thinking and historical analogy, or later we have prospect theory, right? Similar things. Historical analogy, prospect theory, or wishful thinking. What all this means is that people cognitively, they try to maintain cognitive balance. Psychologically, they want to maintain cognitive balance. Okay? So to maintain cognitive balance in terms of making a decision, all these theories, cognitive theories, argue that information doesn't make much of difference in terms of making decisions. Information is not important. Okay? In making decisions, decision makers make a decision sometimes they put a reference point, okay, or some historical analogy. Like, for instance, in deciding on some foreign policy regarding like Vietnam War, okay, in the 1960s, or 9/11, 2011, when presidents or important decision makers, when they make a decision, they think of some historical analogy. Okay? Then they compare these two events. Then they proceed from this comparison, then they make a decision. So all this, I mentioned several different irrational models here. Let's look at, we will cover this here. Misperceptions first, then cognitive bias. Cognitive biases are systemic distortions of rational calculations. Then prospect theory, all these different irrational models. At the end, what all this means is that just this. In other words, individual decision making follows an imperfect and partial kind of rationality. The reason is the goals of different decision makers vary. The goals of individual decision makers are different. And decision making process face a series of obstacles in receiving accurate information. There are two additional things that raise questions about the rationality, which is groupthink, group psychology, and crisis decision making. Individuals, sometimes they make irrational decisions, probably because of cognitive reasons, right? Different reasons, right? Personal background, values, beliefs, and all these, irrational outside factors. But in addition to these outside factors, simply because people are, situated in a group and they make a decision, that also affects decision-making process. That lead people to make a irrational decision-making. This is called groupthink. So groupthink refers to a tendency for groups to reach decisions without accurately assessing their consequences. Crisis decision making is a long explanation, but essentially crisis management means that individual decision makers, they are not free from rational decision making, probably under a crash decision, crisis situation. There are so many things happen at the same time, so that in and of itself leads to irrational decision making. Now, I laid out different individual decision-making theories and some of the examples. And I don't know, just think about it. In terms of explaining wars and major crises in international events, which is more appealing, like a systemic type of explanation. And this type of individual decision-making type of explanation, like I said, both of them are essential and necessary, right? But in international politics, there are so many books about crisis, because there are so many decision making situations in international politics. So the importance of this chapter, particularly individual decision making, is it has a long history, long tradition in international politics. It's kind of difficult. It's difficult to generalize these lessons here. Could you have a 10-minute break and come back to move on to the second, domestic influence? In terms of difference foreign policy makes, I think clearly we need to know how different bureaucratic organizational structures different countries have. We need to see the internal structure of foreign ministry, right? Usually countries have several foreign policy related agencies. Foreign ministry, then you have CIA type of information agency, secret agency, and defense, right? Defense ministry. And also you need to have some presidential type of foreign policy, right? Aide or staff, members in the foreign policy staff within the presidential, right, office. So usually 4 or 5 foreign policy related organizations in many countries, including Korea. South Korea also have a similar structure. So here, when a foreign policy is made, that foreign policy is an outcome of the aggregation of all these different organizational interests, right? So we need to look at the internal makeup, people who make decisions, we need to look at them. Then usually what you care about this bureaucratic model or organizational model is the interagency conflict or rivalry. Interagency conflict or rivalry has a huge impact on foreign policy outcomes. We monitor that closely, particularly those closed countries. We monitor these inter-elite, inter-agency rivalry and conflict because it has a huge impact on foreign policy, including North Korea, even today. The Soviet Union was very well known. Soviet Union was well known for this type of, for outside watchers, this internal bureaucratic conflict and rivalry oftentimes led to a very irrational foreign policy outcomes, unexpected, irrational, crisis type of foreign policy outcome. It was due to sometimes irrational decision makers, leaders, or psycho type of leaders. Stalin was a psycho, right? Or Nazi Hitler. We had many psycho, cognitively absent leaders. We have many types of that. But regardless of that, we have this interagency or interpersonal, inter-elite conflict and rivalry, oftentimes which led to wars and crises. Because it's not a rational process. It's not a rational outcome. So many wars, essentially speaking, many wars are the outcomes of these internal conflicts, elite conflict or agency conflict. This is bureaucratic model or organizational model. So many crises in diplomatic history, right, are due to this type of interagency conflict. Sometimes within the ministry, sometimes conflict or rivalry within the foreign ministry, like State Department has all kinds of different lines. Okay, like for instance, within the State Department, there are many diplomats, but diplomats have different orientations. Some diplomats are like some diplomats are pro-China type of orientation. Some diplomats have pro-Japanese orientations. Sometimes some are like hardliners, right? And others are more softliners, right? Sometimes some diplomats argue within the State Department. I'm talking about the United States. Within the State Department, some argue that the United States should, take a much more hardline approach toward North Korea. Others argue that, we need to loosen up a little bit. Okay, we need to babysit North Korea a little bit so that he can change his mind. So we have different types of people, even within the foreign ministry. In my opinion, I think the aggregation, Won-Chang, you mentioned that, which is a good point, like a realist assumption about broad national interest. Okay, sometimes driven by rational decision making, right? Rationality model, and liberal type of like a view on like a people's interest, social interest. You're right, but here, how, like I said, when you talk about realism and liberalism, how national interests are driven, that is an important point. How national interests are aggregated, right? How national interests are aggregated. Like, in my opinion, I think more advanced countries, more democratic countries, maybe I can ask this question to you. In terms of unified or aggregated national interest, my question to you, to everyone, established democracies or authoritarian or failing states, which country has a better type of, which country does a better job of deriving national interest? I mean, national interest doesn't come easily, right? Doesn't come easily. Realists, they were much too simplified in talking about national interest, a given. We know what national interest is, okay? Because the state is a unitary actor, unitary and rational actor. So that we know national interest is there, is present, clear. That's what realists say. But like I said, I mean, what we saw in the decision-making process, which is a highly oversimplified view, because national interest aggregation process is much more complicated and difficult. Sometimes we never know what is real national interest, because there are all different social actors, right, from the bottom up. Then how these different social actors aggregate into a unified national interest. My question to you is, which country, established democracies and authoritarian, fragile, failing states, which country does a better job of aggregating national interest? Do you think the United States has a clearly defined national interest? Does South Korea have a clearly defined national interest, South Korean national interest? Does North Korea has a clearly defined national self-interest? The reason I'm asking this question is that here, look at this. There is interagency rivalry and conflict over national interest, right? Over a certain issue or national interest, broad national interest, interagency conflict. There are social conflicts, social rivalry over a certain issue. Korea has a divided, Korea is a divided society. Leftist camp, rightist camp. We have a split in half. The whole society is split in half, right? We have a different view. We are the same Koreans, but same Koreans take a different view on whether or not North Korea is an enemy. Totally different view. Maybe 50% of Korean society, they don't think North Korea is an enemy. Right? 50% of Korean society, they might think that America is not an ally of Korea. Then, given this situation, how could we say Korea has a unified national interest? Despite this social rivalry, social conflict, Korean government can step out and say, this is the Korean national interest. Can you do that? This is exactly what this textbook talks about. Now, interest groups. Interest groups, another thing. Interest groups. Did you think, before you come to this class, before you read this chapter, chapter 4, why was I mumbling all this prospect theory and all that? And all this, I hated this prospect and cognitive things. This interest groups, before you read chapter 4, did you think that interest groups affect foreign policy? Yes? No? We have many different social organizations, NGOs. Some are environmental NGOs. Some are just political NGOs. There are many, right? Leftist type of NGOs, right? Do you think they affect foreign policy of Korea? Or there must be many NGOs in the United States, in United States society. Do you think these different NGOs they have a say in terms of what kind of foreign policy America makes? Foreign policy outcomes of the United States, do they have some say on foreign policy issues? Yes?
I think organizations such as IMF have a say on like the international policies on monetary matters, like the interest rates, for example, are strongly affected by their policies, and they try to set the regulations in account of, like, taking account of the perspectives of developed countries. Like, so the policies are targeted towards the developed countries, but not on the developing countries, like the poor countries. So I think that is bringing about serious predicaments, like financial gaps between the poor and the rich countries. So, which has to do with capitalistic society of today.
Yeah. But IMF is not a type of interest group that we are talking about here. IMF is kind of a international organization. What is at issue here is like interest groups. What kind of interest groups are you talking about here? Like in terms of domestic influence. The topic here is domestic influence on foreign policy. That's the topic, right? So in terms of domestic influence on foreign policy, interest groups that we are talking about, interest groups like
Like vested interest.
like a groups of people, interest groups, not simply groups of people that can organizationally lobby the government. It's not a political party, right? Political party interest groups are different. Okay, same groups of people, but political party is much more than officially organized than interest groups. Okay, it should have a representation in Congress. That's political party. Okay, interest groups are different. So interest groups are group of farmers, labor union, or environmental NGOs of different vocations, right? Or companies, big businesses, or ethnic groups. Sometimes ethnic groups form an interest group that can have an effect on government policy. Like group of the United States has many ethnic type of interest groups, right? American, like a group of African American, people, a group of American Armenians, even Armenians, Greek Americans. Particularly, there are some, ethnic-based interest groups that have a strong say in United States foreign policy, which is Jewish. Okay, interest group. And like a military-related industries, right? Military-related industries. Big businesses, military-related industries. According to the textbook, which interest group? We are not talking generally about the influence of interest groups on domestic policy. We're talking about domestic influence. Okay, domestic interest groups' influence on foreign policy. That's the topic. Which interest group has the strongest voice on foreign policy? Which domestic interest group, according to the textbook, which domestic interest group has the strongest voice? I think as I read it, the military-related interest group has the strongest voice. What is this military-related type of interest group called? Military-industrial complex. Military-industrial complex. This is a particular type of interest group because it is so powerful, so influential, and broadly networked. than any other interest group. That's military-industrial complex, MIC, military-industrial complex. What does military-industrial complex include? What is included? The MIC, military-industrial complex. I'm going to read a huge interlocking network of governmental agencies. Number one governmental agency, Defense Ministry, maybe FBI, maybe some other governmental, military-related governmental agencies. Second, industrial corporations. Industrial corporations that produce weapons, equipment. They are part of MIC, industrial corporations. And research institutes on weapons and arms. Right. That's MIC. MIC, according to the textbook, MIC is the most influential on US foreign policy. There's one thing that this textbook, in terms of interest group influence on foreign policy, they lack one thing. What is it? They talk about, yes, IBM, Samsung, huge, they enjoy huge influence on foreign policy, right? Right. US corporations, Korean big Jabil corporations, they have a huge influence on foreign policy. This textbook mentions that, but there is one thing that this textbook lacks. What is it? In terms of domestic interest group foreign policy. Military-industrial complex, yes. Particularly powerful during the Cold War time, right? Soviet military industry was also powerful on Soviet foreign policy. But this textbook lacks one thing, which is the energy industry. The energy industry. I think many wars and many important foreign policy decisions are related, according to this textbook, related to who sells and who buys arms and weapons, right? It is true. And the US is the biggest seller. The Soviet Union maybe comes next, right? Second biggest arms seller, the Soviet Union, and today is Russia. And China rapidly catching up, right? China rapidly catching up with the United States and Russia. China is like buying Soviet, Russian weapons and disassembles and copy them, and they procure some essential technologies now. China rapidly rising. So military-industrial complex, yes, very important. And major wars and major important foreign policies, behind these important wars and foreign policies were these arms-related decisions. It is true. But my argument here, this textbook doesn't mention energy is same. Energy industry same. Maybe more important than arms industry. Again, the US, the biggest. The US has the biggest energy industry. And how energy industry, energy interest groups influence US foreign policy, you name it. I mean, you can have many examples. You can have many examples how US energy companies were behind many important foreign policy decisions and wars. Many wars. US energy interests were behind many wars the United States was involved. So this textbook does mention that, so I want to add. another question from this textbook. Do Marxists think positively on interest group influence on foreign policy? What do Marxists think of domestic interest group influence on foreign policy? So, according to Owen Chang, right? Social, right, interests are like reflected on government policy and national interest, which is a good thing, right? So this interest group influence on foreign policy is a good thing, right? But what do Marxists say about it? Do Marxist theories think that social interest groups' influence on foreign policy is always good or sometimes bad? If bad, why is bad? Domestic influence on foreign policy is sometimes bad from Marxist perspective. Why? That's my question.
I think in case of China, they barely have churches, for example, in China, because it's like a minority in the country, and they can also like have an impact on the people's mind. So I think like they mostly think about the impact that can this kind of minorities influence on the people's mind, because Chinese government has like a how to say spatial policy inside of the country, for example, and it also can influence on the foreign policy in the long run.
No, you didn't get my question correctly. My question was here, same as I, asked previously. In other words, how social interests aggregate, right, into a national interest at the top. Think about it. I mean, essentially, social interest groups' influence on foreign policy is a good thing. But there are many different kinds of interest groups, right? According to Marxists, at the end of the day, what affects foreign policy most is big business. Either big business or particularly during the Cold War, arms industry. That's the question Marxists raise. What question is that? Question is, how do we reflect social feedback on government policy, particularly on foreign policy, in a balanced way? One interest group, one or two big interest groups should not dominate the policy process. That's the point. One time. Am I right? You don't get it. Or you don't agree. You might not agree.
I'm just trying to think about it.
What's your name? What was your point?
I was going to say that Marxists don't think it's good because in the end, like, rich businesses are the ones who have the most influence.
Right.
And so they were the ones who, like, drove the arms race.
Right.
And also, like, colonism.
Right. Yes, exactly. Exactly. What is American answer to that? That's Marxist argument. What is American scholars' take on that? So one particular interest group, big business, for example, they dominate foreign policy process. That's the concern, right? And the arms industry. But what are many American political scientists' answer to that? Nobody knows. Does anybody know? Does anybody critique this Marxist type of interest group, type of view? What is your name? 윤술찬.
Maybe because Americans believe that serious competition is going to as I said, trigger the competition, and all the companies are going to try to beat those what we say as dominant companies in that industry. So obviously, everyone's going to try to work so hard, which is going to be good for both.
Right. Right. You're right. You're right. Right. What is important is the term competition. Competition. Level playing field. Right? Level playing field. Different interest groups push and pull, right? Foreign policy in different directions, right? But at the end of the day, this aggregation process, if it is run by competition, level playing field game, it is okay. It works themselves out. What is this called? What is this process? What is this type of process called? Democracy. Competitive democracy. Competitive democracy. So this concern about, right? This concern about like Samsung, too big in Korea, right? Like in the United States, I don't know, maybe the arms industry. I mean, they have concerns about the U.S. arms industry, military industry, right? We have that problem in Korea, Samsung problem. We have Samsung problem. It's too big, right? We have Samsung problem. I'm not sure whether from a democratic perspective, from a competitive democratic perspective, I don't know how we resolve this issue, Samsung issue, too big Samsung issue from a democratic perspective. That's exactly what Marxists take issue here. How Samsung might influence Korean foreign policy? Did you think about that? Does Samsung have an influence on Korean foreign policy? Must have. How? How would Samsung affect Korean foreign policy? Does anybody know? How would Samsung, companies like Samsung, #1 company here, Korea, lion's share of Korean GDP, how would that company as an interest group affect Korea's foreign policy? What is your name?
Maybe like promote FTAs with countries that they're targeting. So they will be able to sell products at lower price.
So you think that Samsung, clearly they have an influence on foreign policy. And there are certain types of foreign policy agenda Samsung would like to see. So Samsung kind of, according to this textbook, they lobby, right? Interest group, their goal is to lobby the government, right? How do they lobby? They have answer here. How right? How interest groups lobby the government? They have answer here, right? They have everything. They have everything here. How they lobby the government? Because this is a textbook. They have everything. How interest groups lobby the government? Let me read it to you. they meet legislators. Companies like Samsung, they meet with congressmen or government officials. They talk with them. And then they introduce their company policy, right? Company items, new products. Explain that to these congressmen, government bureaucrats, right? Let them know about it, right? That's a lobby. But maybe they do it in combination with some, right? Wining, dining, right? Golfing. That's a lobby. Same thing. United States, Korea, everywhere, same. Lobby is same. That's how they influence Korean foreign policy. So they might meet Korean diplomats, foreign ministry officials, and congressmen who work in the foreign ministry committee, right? So these company, officials, they want to meet them. That's how they influence. It's like a small, like a softball type of influence or lobby. There are much more hardball type of lobby, right? What are these hardball type of lobby? The hardball type of lobby is that like a chairman of Samsung Group, right? Chairman of Samsung Group, the Mr. Lee, he meets up with president. Okay, one-to-one meeting, president, right? Then he proposes a donation of billions of dollars to government for the benefit of the government's policy, right? Samsung donations. But in return, the president might help him promote company interest. But there's no promise. Because at that level, president doesn't promise, right? That's it. That's how Samsung influenced Korean foreign policy. What did you think, Won Chang?
I think another explanation is that Samsung company and LG company as well showing the good result of GDP, and as we learned from the previous lectures, a good GDP level is mean the power. So simply speaking, Samsung making GDP for the country flourishing, and that is why country actually needs to support this kind of companies in order to promote different kind of foreign policies. Yes, that is what I want to say.
Okay, so Samsung and the Korean government.
Yeah, because if you take, for example, crisis, if the crisis happen in Korea, government, I think, has to support the Samsung company in case of the crisis, because maybe 1/3 of the Korean GDP is made by the Samsung company, and it's not profitable for the country, for the government as a whole system to lose the money and also like respect from other countries. This is how Samsung is actually impact on the
Right. So you think that Samsung is like they make a huge contribution to Korean, like Korea's image and GDP.
Not only Samsung, but maybe top companies like SKT, KT, LG, Hyundai, Kia. They making a lot of money for the country because they're selling the products outside of the Korea, so they making money from the export.
Right.
So they paying taxes for the government, and government as well making money from this
Right.
company.
But we not only Koreans but also many objective
Yeah.
analysts, they are worried. they're worried about maybe too much influence. Samsung wills. Yes.
I remember that Samsung would help Korea in launching the Winter Olympics. If the government leaves President Lee,
What Olympics?
Winter Olympics.
Winter Olympics. Okay. Right. So, my point is that it's better when you have unified, social cohesion is always a good thing, right? Every citizen has a unified view on where the country should go. It's a good thing for the country. But essentially, every country has social divisions, right? Social divisions. But despite that social division, we need to outsiders, we need to present unified, right, foreign policy, right? The more divided the society, the more conflictual that aggregation process, right? In extreme situation, the country doesn't even have a unified view. Maybe different organizations represent different interests. In that case, that country almost is not a government, is not a state, right?